Thank you very much. The pandemic caused by COVID-19 is the example that we, the world, need, indeed, all of us in the world. Hunger, unemployment, economic decadence, the field of injustice, the rising gap between the richest and the poorest. How can we think about well-being, as it was asked right now? It's time to give the floor to Professor Trevor Farrow from Osgoode Law School, a Canadian institution, who will speak about the social return on investment in justice, a vision on the need to build bridges and to protect the most vulnerable groups of our societies, and how it pays off, and not only in monetary terms. Trevor Farrow, welcome.
Boa tarde, bonjour, and hello. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is indeed a great pleasure to be back in Portugal, even if only virtually this time. And it is a real honor and a great pleasure to be part of this incredible high-level conference. I've been really enjoying the sessions so far today. Even though it's been quite an early morning over here in North America. If I could trouble my conference colleagues to put up my presentation that I've entitled Justice in Crisis, and looking at notions, the idea of investment. And what I'll do is, with your help, I'll move to the next screen. If you could move to the next screen now, the next slide. And I'll probably be moving quite fairly quickly. So I have three questions that I'm going to discuss with you today, and it really picks up on some of the themes that we've been looking at earlier. So the first question is, what is at stake in this conversation, or put differently, why should we care? Secondly, looking at justice funding and being honest about the question, is it really a priority for us right now in the world? And then third, looking at the main theme of investing in justice, the idea of return on investment, and looking at the question, does it make sense? So next slide, please. Turning to the first question, what is at stake? Next slide. And we heard, if you could turn to the next slide, we heard this morning, and again we've heard several times, the idea that there are many people in the world. According to the recent Pathfinders report, over 5 billion people, 2/3 of the world's population, lives without meaningful access to justice. So the Secretary General spoke about trust. The Secretary General spoke about needs. And the Secretary General spoke about data. So let's look at some of that need and data briefly in answer to the question, why do we care? Next slide, please. And so that's what I want to do now. And actually to do so, what I want to do is look at what it is that not what I'm saying, not what the policymakers are saying, but what are the people saying? Next slide, please. And so what I'm going to do is look at some of the research that we've done here in Canada on talking to people about justice and their needs with the purpose of asking, why do we care? And before I carry on, I should say that the research in Canada is very similar to lots of the legal needs research around the world. And so I'm going to speak about the Canadian context and some of the research that I've been working on with my colleagues here. But I do believe, having looked at the comparative research around the world, that it is very applicable regardless of which country we're coming from. It's surprisingly similar, actually. Next slide, please. So the question that I'm going to start with, or look at, and just go fairly quickly through some of the basics. If we talk about why do we care, first of all, it's the volume of people that are the number of people that experience justice problems. In Canada, it's about half of all Canadians, adult Canadians, experience a serious justice problem every 3 years. That means essentially all of us over the course of our lifetime. In Canada, which has a population of approximately 36 million people, we have approximately 36 million legal problems every 3 years. So we're not talking about a small issue here. Next slide, please. And then when we look into those numbers, people don't experience them equally. More than half of those people who experience one problem will have more than one problem. The more problems that people have, the more they will continue to have. We can predict with a fair degree of certainty based on age, ability, number of children, education, employment, gender, race, income, different predictive variables about how people will experience justice in the system. And then, of course, justice is not experienced equally. Low-income people, vulnerable people, people living on the margins experience more injustice. And as we know, and has been discussed at this conference, of course, the pandemic has done nothing but amplify or increase those problems and inequalities. Next slide, please. Then, if we're looking at this from a systems perspective, if we ask the question, how do people address their problems? Again, it is not unfamiliar data. Most problems do not go to courts and tribunals, and this is similar with many countries around the world. Less than 7% of problems go to courts and tribunals, and less than 20% of legal problems are dealt with legal advice. That is a remarkable set of statistics when we're thinking about where we invest and how we invest in justice. Having said that, my point is not that courts and lawyers are a bad thing. In fact, I think they're a good thing. And when we look at my next slide, if you ask people, how helpful is it when they get legal advice, for example, most people, over 80%, say it's very helpful. In fact, more helpful than other forms of advice. And so the idea is not to replace courts and lawyers because they're a bad thing. As we've looked at already today and in many other places, and I listened carefully to Professor Susskind's comments, the idea is to try and find ways to rethink and innovate about how we deploy the right services in the right place. And the data, as the Secretary General talked about, is very important as we think about how to redeploy and rethink these things. Now, what about cost? Before I leave this first question that I'm talking about today, which is why do we care? Let's look at the cost of experiencing justice or not experiencing justice. I'm going to use Canadian dollars, but as I've put on this slide with if you could go to the next slide, please. I'd ask you to turn to the next slide. Yes, thank you. Just so for those of you looking at the euro, $1 Canadian is approximately 0.8 US dollars and approximately 0.6 euros. So not quite half. But just to give you a flavor of what it costs for an everyday person in Canada who experiences one legal problem, they spend on average about $6,000. So what does that mean in terms of their life? Well, by comparison, it's almost as much as a household spends on food every year, or almost half as much as Canadians spend annually on their housing. So these are not small numbers by comparison with other big items in their life. And then when we aggregate this over the course, I'm not talking about small businesses or corporations. We're talking about individuals spend over almost $8 billion annually to deal with their problems. And that does not include other costs like missed opportunities, lost holidays, lost income in order to figure out how to deal with their problems. Next slide, please. And of course, these are not only the only costs. As we studied these costs in Canada, other costs that are equally, if not more important, are the emotional and physical costs resulting from or impacting individuals when they experience a justice problem, which are significant, as the data shows. And not only emotional health and physical health, but loss of employment, a need for going on social assistance from the state, and also a loss of housing. So the costs, the direct economic and the related costs are huge. And next slide, please. And then finally, when we look at aggregate state-based costs, these are the kinds of costs that we found very conservatively. We expect the costs are actually much higher, are close to $1 billion every year, knock-on costs to the state when people do not experience adequate access to justice. So when we ask the question, why do we care? One answer would be to take seriously what people are saying and to look at the cost, the impact, not only on individuals, but collectively on the state as well. Next slide, please. Having said that, next slide, please. If actually, if you can, and so the other thing that was raised, if we listen to Professor Susskind this morning, one of his requirements of justice in his 7 points towards the end was distributive justice, or the notion of equality and fairness. Well, when we ask people what they think about justice and access to justice, the story we heard and we often hear is not very happy, in the sense that people report back that it's very economic based, it's opportunity based, it's often class based. And people report back that it depends on what lawyer you can afford. Higher class have more people. If I don't look good, if I don't have a good suit, the judge isn't going to hear me. Immigrants are much more susceptible. And then predictive values around language, education, culture, age, sexual orientation, poverty, homelessness, and where people live are all issues that people express in terms of their problems around inaccessibility. So if one of the requirements of our current justice system is distributive fairness, we are not meeting that at the current stage. Next slide, please. And so, you know, when we get to the question of what is at stake or why should we care, I think the answer is patently clear, very clear in the research. Having said that, if we're not persuaded about the research, and our host, who is a journalist, will, I think, appreciate this as well, because we often are unmoved by data, and what we really want are people's stories. And of course, that's what we're trying to tell in the research. Next slide, please. But if we don't care about the research, one theory is simply look around, that the current status quo is unsustainable for a lot of people, whether we look at the number of 5.1 billion or we simply look at what's going on around us in the world. One reason for why we should care about this conversation and why we should care about the idea of investment is all around us. With that, next slide, please. I'd like to turn to my second question for this afternoon, which is, if the data is there, and if we see this all around us, the question is justice funding a priority? Are we taking this seriously? An observer of this situation would think, of course we must be, because it is so serious. Well, I'm going to then point fingers back to my own country again, and I'd like the next slide, please. We like to think in Canada that we have a fabulous legal aid system, and we do. We have a very creative, innovative system, particularly in the province that I'm currently in. I'm in Toronto now, in the province of Ontario. But if I look at the actual availability of legal aid, I don't expect you to be able to see all these numbers. I've highlighted two that I think matter. In our country, the cutoff for providing legal aid to a single person is approximately $17,000. That's the maximum that someone can make annually if they are going to be able to access legal aid. If one compares that to our poverty line in Canada, that poverty line is set at approximately $20,000. So to access legal aid, people need to not only be poor, they need to be below the poverty line and significantly below the poverty line before they will qualify for legal aid. So what are our politicians saying? And I'm not trying to pick on us only, but it must be then the case that people would be taking this seriously. Well, recently in Ontario, our efforts have not been dramatically successful in increasing legal aid. In fact, next slide, please. What's happened is legal aid has been cut. And not only that, have some of our elected politicians been heard saying things like, while some lawyers may not welcome renewed accountability at legal aid, every dollar saved is a dollar we can invest in the services that matter most to people, such as public health care and education. So at this point, we're starting to see the gap. A massive need. The people are suggesting, when we look at the data, the justice needs are all around us. And yet the story of our funding, are we funding this problem, is not particularly impressive. Next slide, please. But if we go back to the research, and if we actually ask people what they think about whether justice matters, next slide, please. The answer that we are told by the public is absolutely. It should be a number one right. I'm glad you're asking these questions. It should be as important as our health care. And then next slide, please. And if we ask the question, should citizens have a right to justice? Almost 100% of people say yes. So again, the gap between at least what some politicians are saying and some governments are pressed in terms of how we are distributing our public dollars either towards or away from justice, there's a disconnect between what the public is saying and what our budgets are saying. So then, let me please go with my next slide to the third question I want to speak with you this afternoon, which is, well then, if justice is important as we think it is, if there is this gap in funding, the question is, does it make sense now to invest in justice? And I don't want to suggest that public funding is unlimited. The government officials and Treasury board members and leaders of our political parties will know much better than me that budgets are tight, tax dollars are tight, and there isn't a lot of money. But the question is it the case that we should be investing in other things as opposed to justice, or does it make sense, in fact, to start looking at the idea of reinvesting in justice? So let's turn to the research, and I'll ask you to turn to my next slide. At the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice, we were tasked to, next slide please, commissioned by the Task Force on Justice a year or so ago to prepare a report called Investing in Justice. And this was a project that was asked to look around the world at all of the return on investment and social return on investment data that is out there, as much as we could find in different sectors: legal aid commissions, legal aid, law centers, courts, paralegals, tribunals, pro bono, all the different areas, and to look at what the story is and what the data is saying about the value of investing in justice. And to cut to the conclusion, the overwhelming findings in this report that we prepared is that there is a positive return on investment, meaning that when one invests €1 in justice, typically the return on investment is much more than €1. At the same time, I encourage you also to look at the World Bank's A Tool for Justice report. It has a different focus, but very different, similar findings, and it's an important report that came out at a similar time that's very valuable on this topic. Next slide, please. Now, I won't take you through all of the nuances of the report. The report is there for everyone to see. And I have a couple of slides just to give you a flavor, a very quick flavor. But when we looked around at the US, Australia, different countries in Central Asia or South Asia and elsewhere, really around the world, the story was very similar. And essentially, on average, for example, when we talk about investing in legal aid, if you spend $1 on legal aid, typically the return on investment is somewhere between $9 and $16 back. Next slide, please. And so when you, whether it's pro bono, whether it's family law services, I'll come back to family law in a minute, whether it's youth justice, whether it's investing in community legal centers in Australia, whether it's community-based paralegals in South Africa. There's a fabulous study out of Bangladesh, a community-based project in Bangladesh that was self-sustaining. All of these examples are examples of a positive return on investment. Next slide, please. And so the obvious conclusion, which I've already mentioned, is that if I go back to that politician's statement saying we're better off to invest $1 in healthcare or education, in fact, that argument is a flawed argument. It is not the case that investing in justice is simply a cost on the budget. What we're seeing, in fact, is that it's a positive return that will make more money available in the long run, not only for justice, but also for other services, social services, health services, etc. A different study that I'll very briefly mention that looks not directly at the return on investment, which is typically done based on economic return, dollar return. Next slide, please. But looking at a social return on investment project that we looked at here in Canada a couple of years ago. It was a small study, but very instructive. Next slide, please. And the idea of social return on investment, it is really an estimate that looks at the estimate of investing $1 in one service. If you look at factors including the length of a process, the perceived fairness, satisfaction with outcome, potential for future conflict, cost to the system generally, the social return on investment approach then estimates what that value add is, and you will come out with either a positive, neutral, or negative number. Next slide, please. So what this study did was looked at both low conflict and high conflict family disputes, and it did so through 4 different types of processes: collaboration, mediation, arbitration, and litigation, and then made the assessments of what would be the value return for $1 invested in those kinds of services in the context of low conflict family disputes. And from the slide, you can see that in lower process, more informal processes like collaboration, the return on investment is higher, almost 2 for 1. In litigation for low conflict disputes, it's actually the opposite. For $1 spent on litigation, the return on investment was less than $1, so it was a negative return. Next slide, please. In high conflict cases, for example, you see more neutral returns on investment and sometimes negative return. So this is the reason I give you this is not to say that somehow disputes processes should not be used in family law, not at all. It's to show an example of a study where it matters what you're talking about and what particular kind of process for a particular kind of dispute, and calibrating investments and services in those particular areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of concluding all this and sort of where do we go, the idea of this, of the trajectory of this discussion has been the question, we talk a lot about innovation, we talk a lot about eJustice, we talk a lot about reform. It seems so obvious. And so the question is, why are we not there yet? And I think there are several factors. One is, I think we need to somehow reframe the story. We need to listen to the public. We need to be serious about the data, and we need to be serious about what are we seeing us around us, whether it's eco-justice, racial justice, sexual orientation justice, family justice, any numbers of factors. We are not happy with the current story and the current level of justice that people are accessing. Secondly, are we actually taking that story seriously and investing in justice? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, the answer to that is no. We are not adequately investing in justice, whether it's money, energy, innovations, efforts around public-private partnerships, what have you. There is still a long way to go to bridge that investment gap or taking seriously that funding. And then thirdly, if we're worried about making that step, bridging that gap, the question then becomes, does it make sense to make that investment? And the research, the recent research is overwhelmingly yes. In fact, it does not, it only makes sense to invest in justice. It doesn't make sense not to invest in justice. So in terms of a conclusion, I think, that's where we get to. There are lots of ways of thinking about this. I think we need to shift our focus from institutions to the people. I think we need to shift our focus to problems, to people, to understanding how people understand problems, and looking at the real barriers, systemic racism, gender bias, etc. And then thinking about, where do people actually need justice? What does justice need to look like? And being honest about the fact that investing in justice really does, in the 21st century, make sense. And so, speaking of now and the future, it just, whenever I read the newspaper, which is every day, I just can't help but think, if we can land probes on Mars, if we can now fly helicopters on Mars, if we can go and get rocks from asteroids and come back, if we can solve a pandemic within a year, if we can do all of these things, then fixing the justice problem, it seems much easier than what we're doing elsewhere. I think this is not only within our reach, but it is required that we do this and do it now. Next slide, please. And so with that, I say merci, obrigada, and thank you for including me in what I think is such an important and interesting high-level conference over these 2 days.